Soren Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher who was a Christian but argued that truth can be subjective and that God's existence can neither be proven or disproven. He argued that faith in God cannot be based on reasoned argument. In his book Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments, published under a pseudonym in 1846, he outlined 3 modes of existence, or stages that a person goes through as they develop. The aesthetic mode is an immature state, where a person is primarily interested in the pursuit of pleasure. It is largely self-serving and egoistic, and involves a person seeking meaning in life from making themselves happy or satisfied. As a person matures, they progress to the ethical mode, in which they progress to understanding a sense of obligation towards those around them. In this mode, a person understands that they have a duty to help others or to perform particular acts that benefit other people rather than just themselves. There is still a search for meaning, however, that may be found in the assumption of the religious mode of existence. Here a person understands that meaning comes from obedience to God rather than concern with earthly things. In the aesthetic mode, one is ruled by passion. In the ethical mode, we are ruled by obligation to others. In the religious mode, we are ruled by faith. As a Christian existentialist, Kierkegaard was concerned with finding meaning in life to escape boredom, anxiety, and despair. Existentialists are those who argue that life is essentially a blank canvas onto which we may project our own meaning. Here, who or what we are is not decided for us, but instead we decide. We are solely responsible for attaining meaning in our lives. For most existentialists, this means that life is depressing, complex, and baffling. There is little purpose unless we find it for ourselves, and then we have sole responsibility for all that happens and how we respond. What makes Kierkegaard different is that he was also a Christian. Meaning can then be found if we move to the religious mode of life, in which we can discover a sense of purpose. Faith is then essential for finding meaning, which for Kierkegaard is entirely subjective. The religious mode, of course, cannot be arrived at via reasoned argument. Kierkegaard is a voluntarist. It requires a leap of faith. It is the only path that makes meaning possible, but it is neither rational nor empirical. This makes it challenging to follow, because we do not have the safety or security of reason or physical evidence to support us. The vital thing about the religious mode is that it requires passionate commitment. One cannot take a leap of faith without committing wholeheartedly to it, since it is a risk. But Kierkegaard claims it is a risk worth taking for the benefits in the long term. Faith for Kierkegaard is a leap into the unknown, but on the other hand, the leap is justified or reasonable. Faith is a choice to surrender to God rather than reason, which is human searching. An example that Kierkegaard gives of this leap of faith is the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. Abraham had been promised descendants by God, yet his wife was unable to have children and they were getting very old. Abraham had to have faith that God would keep his promise, and at times the faith of Abraham and his wife Sarah did waver. However, when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, they did have one child. When Isaac was older, God tested Abraham, but by requiring him to sacrifice his son to him. At the time, the sacrifice of a goat or a lamb was common religious practice. You would give up one of your best livestock to God to show that you had dedication to him. Here God was requiring the ultimate sacrifice. Abraham knew that God had promised him descendants, and yet his only son was to be killed. This required tremendous faith and trust in God's plan, even though Abraham didn't understand it. Normally, of course, killing is considered wrong. There's a command against it in the Bible. Yet Abraham did as God required. At the last moment, God provided a lamb for Abraham to kill instead, and Isaac was spared. Abraham had shown, though, that he was willing to give God the passionate commitment that he required. True faith. For Kierkegaard, religious faith requires certainty, whereas reason can only give us probability. Kierkegaard offers 3 arguments to demonstrate that faith in God cannot be based on reasoned arguments. His first is the Approximation Argument. Here he points out that the most we can get from reasoning is a likelihood that God exists. We can conclude that God probably exists, or that he probably does not, but no certainty. As a non-empirical entity, it is not possible for us to seek out the empirical evidence that conclusively demonstrates his existence. God is supposed to be transcendent and perfect, and so will be beyond the scope of human reasoning. It is then impossible to do more than conclude the idea that God might exist. This is unsatisfactory, and thus faith in God requires a certainty behind the commitment. Abraham did not get ready to kill his only son because God might exist. He did it out of a certainty that God required this of him. Faith requires more than just an approximation of God. However, we can challenge Kierkegaard's claim here. Does faith really require 100% certainty in order to be true faith? One can argue that the faith venture actually acknowledges that we cannot be certain, and yet we commit to a way of life anyway. The whole point of faith is that it is uncertain. In addition, all we can really know from this argument is that Kierkegaard says we can't use reason, but he doesn't really give us any firm reason why we should agree with him. We might disagree and say that faith needs to be underpinned by such rational argument. Kierkegaard's second argument is the postponement argument. Here he points out that if we use reason, we are constantly needing to amend our judgments in the light of new evidence. We cannot commit to reasoned argument as it is amended and revised in the light of new information. Science constantly needs to revise its conclusions when new evidence comes to light, and as a result reassesses what it considers to be true. This is not compatible as an approach with faith, since faith requires commitment to a belief that is not open to revision. If we rely on reason for our faith, then we will be constantly putting off making a commitment to a conclusion about the existence of God, because we will never have enough evidence to be certain. However, is Kierkegaard really correct here? Reason can come to some conclusions that do not require revision. For example, 2 + 2 = 4. But Kierkegaard would point out that this is as much of a leap of faith as that of the religious person. Here the rationalist has faith in reason as the most accurate way to truth. Alternatively, we can challenge Kierkegaard by pointing out the arrogance of his position. The assumption that one unsupported position must be right, regardless of the evidence either way, and that it need never be revised, lacks humility. But Kierkegaard would respond that this misunderstands faith. Faith is not the same as just a belief. Here faith is a deep and passionate commitment to a way of life, rather than mere acceptance of a proposition. If we suspend judgment whilst we wait to see if the existence of God can be proven, we will die waiting. We do not have forever to wait and see. Thirdly and finally, Kierkegaard gives us the passion argument. Here he points out that reason is not only no use to the person of faith, but is actually damaging to faith. It is an obstacle to faith. The more risky and costly the faith is, the more valuable it is. If we look back to Abraham, his faith could have cost him everything, and as a result it was far more valuable to God than forced belief. Reason, if it were able to prove God's existence, would force us to accept his existence. Faith is more worthwhile and more passionate without reason, which requires a commitment in spite of everything. It is thus a personal commitment that would be impossible if reason were involved. This is fiducia, a personal commitment or trust, despite there being so much that is unknown. However, we can point out that this view gives us carte blanche to believe anything we like. This view values the crazy beliefs, the ones that defy all rationality, more highly than those that seem to make sense. This is not only odd, but is potentially dangerous. The valuable beliefs are the ones on which we have no basis, no foundation, no reasoning, and thus cannot support our life choices and behaviour in any meaningful way. What kind of ethical or moral behaviour could this approach justify? Matthew 7:24 speaks about the wise man who builds his house upon rock and the foolish who builds his house upon sand. In the biblical passage, the suggestion is that if we build our house upon faith in God, we are wise. However, if we take Kierkegaard seriously, are we not guilty of building our house upon sand?